Two lives, one secret, a love that refused to sink. When Hollywood producer Ben Howell dies by suicide, he leaves behind a single unassuming key and a lifetime of unanswered questions. His estranged son, Will, expects to tie up those loose ends, but what he finds instead is a hidden journal that unlocks more than just a door. It unleashes the voice of a 17-year-old boy named Benji, trapped forever on the decks of the Titanic as it plunged toward disaster. Standing at the edge of his father's truth, Will must decide, was Ben's death the end of the story or the beginning of setting a soul free? From the depths of history comes a sweeping, heartbreaking novel of forbidden love, family secrets, and the unbearable cost of life unlived. Ladies and gentlemen, hello. Welcome to Season 2 of Titanic Legacy, a podcast that explores Titanic's lasting impact through conversations with creative, interesting, and inspirational people. Authors, artists, historians, actors, filmmakers, musicians, entrepreneurs, and more, who continue to keep the Ship of Dreams legacy not only alive, but thriving through their creative work, their hobbies, storytelling, and conversations. I'm your host, Paul Carganilla, and today we have the pleasure of getting to know Tim Baker, an actor, screenwriter, author. His newest book is He Jumped First, a Titanic-centered piece of fiction, a new novel that is poignant. It's a poignant blend of historical fiction, forbidden romance, and LGBTQ plus love, sweeping readers from the gilded decks of the Titanic to the silver shadows of Hollywood. A little bit about Tim. Tim is a Midwest-born, East Coast-raised transplant who now calls Los Angeles home, and he's fueled by a healthy dose of sarcasm and a lifelong love for history. He writes about dynamic, flawed, and multifaceted characters, probably because he finds perfect people incredibly boring. On the surface, Tim may be little more than an iced coffee enthusiast, but below the waterline, he is driven by a lifelong love for history, Art Deco, the timeless glamour of old Hollywood, and of course, old ships. I'm excited to chat with him and introduce him here to our Titanic Legacy podcast community. And it's also kind of an introduction to him for anyone who's joining us for Titanic weekend on the Queen Mary in just a couple of weeks. It's coming right up. He's going to be our first presenter for the weekend, and you can find out all about it at titanicweekend.com. We'll chat about it a little bit in a little bit, but ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, join me in welcoming author Tim Baker.
Well, thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me and your live studio audience.
Oh, man, I'm so glad to connect with you. On the very first episode of this podcast, I had Clifford Ismay, and he said something so poignant that has just stuck with me as just a theme that ties everything together in all of these conversations. And that's Titanic was a ship that was designed and built to bring people together. And even though she went down on her maiden voyage, her first crossing, she's still doing that today. And that's what fascinates me. And why I started this podcast in the first place was just seeing all the creative stuff that continues to be made and come into the world based on this ship, this hunk of iron that went down in a tragic end. And you are obviously someone who's keeping that legacy going. And connecting with people on the great virtual interwebs and Instagrams. And thanks for reaching out to me and sending me an advanced copy of your book. I'm sorry it took me so long to get this interview together, but He Jumped First. Let's start before we dig into the story, your Titanic story. Let me guess, because through all my interviews, people come to Titanic around between ages 8 and 10. What was yours?
Mine was 9, right in the middle.
There you go. How did it jump out at you? How'd she snag you?
Well, believe it or not, I'm one of the old people. I found out about it before James Cameron's film came out. And I didn't find out about it through A Night to Remember or anything like that. I remember I was in fourth grade, and my cousin was in my class, and he must have watched a documentary about sinking ships because he told me about it, but he confused a bunch of different ships. And so he was telling me it was a ship on its way to California. There were a lot of people on there that were going to family reunions, and they were throwing their babies overboard. So I think part of that came from Lusitania, the throwing the babies overboard. So I think everything he said sounded so confusing that I thought, I want to look more into this. So that's when I started researching it.
Like, I need the real story.
Right. And he was very off, very off.
And you say old people, but like, so how did you get your content? Did you go to the library?
Yeah, I mean, the internet existed, obviously, but when I was in school at this time, our elementary school had one computer that was able to go online, and your classroom had to reserve it for the week. So we would wheel this cart from classroom to classroom, and you had to, reserve your time to go online. So for me, the bulk of it was going to my school library, or whenever I went to the mall with my family, I would go into Walden Books or, Borders. And I don't really remember Barnes and Noble being a big deal back then, but and I would always go into the history section and just sit there the whole time that my family was shopping in the mall and just read over Titanic books. And eventually I would start earning money doing odd jobs around my house. And I became this collector of Titanic books. So like everybody else, the Ken Marshall and Don Lynch book, Titanic in Illustrated History, I think was my first book. And I just started collecting all these books. And after a couple of years, the movie came out, and then that made it really huge in my school. And I became kind of popular because people knew that I had all these books. So people would reserve these books for me, and I would loan out these Titanic books to people.
You were the Titanic library for your friends.
I was Titanic guy.
I love that. And I'm a huge consumer of Titanic podcasts, and I love the story about for Titanic Talk, Alexandra had an audition, and her friend Nelson was this huge Titanic guy with a collection, and so she tapped into him as a resource. It sounds like you were that resource for your friends. I love it. And obviously another Titanic podcast that I love is Unsinkable. You did an episode a few weeks back with LA, and I heard all about your journey with Cameron's film. But for anybody listening who hasn't heard that podcast, tell us about your experience, or the bumpy road that led you to finally watch the movie.
My goodness, it was a bumpy road. So mentioning that I was a fan before the film came out, imagine my delight when I heard it hit the press that this new movie was going to come out, this blockbuster movie. It was supposed to be the most visually accurate representation of Titanic ever. And at that time, they were saying that they went to the carpet manufacturers and they went to like all these original plans. And I'm a big details guy. And visually, I love details. And so I was like, I can't wait for this. And then production was delayed. They went over time, over budget. So it was supposed to be released in 96. And then they said, well, now it's going to be 97. So I was already crestfallen to have to wait another year. And during that time, to keep people's interest, they started releasing more and more info about the film. And that's when they started talking about the content ratings. And I come from a very conservative family. And my mom heard some of the stuff that was going to be in it. And she said, you are not watching this movie. And I was devastated. And especially when the movie came out and people were watching it, and come to find out the content rating was because of a scene, the drawing scene with Kate Winslet.
Sure.
Because I was a boy, I wasn't able, but my sister, because she was a girl, was able to watch it. And that made me even more mad because she got to see it and I didn't. And she didn't even care about the Titanic.
Wild.
So I finally got to watch it when I think I was 15. At my grandparents' house. I happened to be spending a weekend there, and I found they had the 2 VHS set, and so I finally watched it without anybody knowing.
Oh, you just reminded me, and it happens to be right here. So I don't know if you know this about me, but I collect the VHS tape. I started collecting before I knew about that crazy Florida man.
Yeah, the one that has like a whole room full of them.
Yeah, so I started my collection. I just got a new one from a friend from Florida. I haven't even opened yet, and it happens to just be right here. We did not plan this at all.
Look at this unboxing.
But yeah, so I had this dream of having the biggest Titanic VHS collection in the world. And I started collecting. I had about 13 or 14, and then I found out about this man in Florida, and I just gave up all hope. But thank you to Meredith Hudson for sending me. I think this is like my 120-something-ish copy, but
Oh, seriously?
thank you very
Wow.
much. Yeah, I've got a whole wall full here too. But thank you, Meredith, if you're out there listening. Yeah, so it's crazy the way that Cameron's film relit the fire, and now AI is doing the same thing, but it's just like, I wouldn't say that the enthusiasm for Titanic was dying out in the late 90s, but with Cameron's film, it definitely started the enthusiasm like wildfire again, and I don't think it's slowed down since then.
I agree. I think it's now more than ever on the forefront. It's pop culture now, so every generation still knows the movie. And even Gen Zs, I mean, I'm a millennial, so we talk about Gen Zs and how different we are, but they're just as fascinated by it. So it's here to stay for a while.
And people who continue to create fiction, historical fiction, like yourself, are helping to continue the story and the legacy going, moving forward, like every day. What I was excited to talk to you today because you're such a creative person, and I love delving into the creative process. I started podcasting with my original podcast, covepod, just talking to creative people and exploring, what keeps their fire going, and what, it inspires them to continue to follow their heart's fire every day into new projects, when it could be just as easy to sit down and watch TV, binge a new Netflix show. No, you sit down and you're just drawn to create. When did you start writing?
I started writing probably around the time I moved to Los Angeles in 2017. I maybe a little bit before. As an actor, I always wanted to be an actor from the time I was a kid, and I grew up in a family, like I said, very conservative family. They weren't into the arts, so I was kind of the odd man out for that reason. And we grew up in very rural areas. So I grew up in a town of 13 people. So imagine being in the middle of the buckle of the Bible Belt and a town of 13 people telling everyone that when I grow up, I'm going to move to Hollywood and be an actor. That's not really a thing. I mean, nobody took me seriously and people thought I was crazy.
How?
So,
I'm sorry to interrupt.
sure.
How is a town 13 people?
My family made up 5 of them. So, I mean, we were tiny. Last I heard, they don't even have a post office anymore. So they lost their zip code. They're not even really an incorporated community anymore. I think they're still on maps. But yeah, it's a tiny little town. It was in a valley. So you drive down one mountain and it says you're entering town. You drive out the other one, it says you're leaving town. It was that small. But that's where I'm from.
Wow.
And to move from there to Los Angeles is quite a big difference. But anyway, so my whole life, I was the only one that really believed I would do this. And when I graduated high school, I, of course, didn't have any credits and I didn't really have any chances to act because I didn't grow up around community theater or anything. So I finally looked into theater as a way to build up my resume. And so I started performing with theater companies professionally. And during that time, I thought, okay, well, I have to start getting creds for acting on film and TV. So I just started writing scenes that I could record for my reel. And I had a friend who was a director. And I said, hey, would you mind reading over these and maybe help direct me for my scenes from my reel? And he read them and he's like, well, this is actually really good. And you have a through line for these scenes. Because I just wrote several different scenes that showed range. And he said, these actually have a through line and you can make this a feature film if you want to. And so I turned it into a feature and had some producers look at it and they wanted to help me fund it. And I was like, okay, well, maybe I can write. And that kind of took off.
It reminds me of my story. It reminds me of 2 stories. It reminds me of James Dean coming out to Hollywood with no credits, but he had done some high school plays and stuff, but from a small town. But also, I was kind of the same way. I was an actor. I mostly I worked professionally at the Disney parks as a performer, so I was being paid as a professional actor, but I wanted to be on screen. So, and that was like when YouTube became a thing and you could create your own content. And that's when I self-taught screenwriting and started writing and just found a joy in bringing characters to life. One thing that I discovered early on in the writing process, and I'd love to hear your take on it, is once you start on a script or a story and you establish these characters, and you want to go into it with a framework and an outline of the story beats. But then I found early on that my characters started making their own decisions and the story would evolve based on these characters from my head, but like against my original idea. Have you experienced that? And what kind of emotion does that evoke?
Oh my gosh, yeah, that is the exciting thing. I think even with my first feature, I discovered that, and every time now, whether I'm writing a novel or writing a screenplay for a pilot or a film, same thing. I go into it with kind of I say a loose structure. You usually have like, I kind of know where I want it to begin. I certainly know where the turning point is, the climax and the denouement, all that stuff. And the ending I usually have. But as I'm going through, sometimes things will shift because as I'm writing, I too discover these characters are starting to write their own story. And instead of me writing, I'm now an audience member or a reader. And I have these moments where I'll be typing and I just sit back and I'm like, oh my God. Oh my God. And I get so excited because I feel like I'm discovering the story just like the people who are going to consume this are discovering it. And it's such a cool thing. It feels like an out of body experience.
I love it. I get goosebumps just hearing you talk about it. It's such a fun part of the process. And so you start writing your screenplays and your scenes. Eventually, you become a novelist. How did that happen?
Well, that happened through my screenwriting. So when I first started doing some scripts, my first script that I wrote as a feature was one that I had some producers wanting to help me finance it. And I, of course, wrote the lead for myself as an actor, as you do. I was a Ben Stiller or Ben Affleck and Matt Damon type project. But the problem was along the way, I had made promises to people. Well, I want to put you in this role. I want to put you in this role. And when I started talking at the negotiation table with these producers, they were like, "Yeah, of course, we'll let you play the lead, but all these other roles, we want to cast people with names. We want to do this." And I was quickly losing control of the project, which
Mhm.
I get. I had no gravitas to sort of negotiate what I wanted, and I thought the only way that I can make a project and keep my integrity, keep all these promises, is if I have something else to show for it. So before I signed off on anything, I said, you know what? I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to take my project and shelf it for now and work on something else just to be able to have some leverage next time I come around. I didn't necessarily tell them about the leverage thing, but so I started writing a second feature, a follow-up that I could produce myself out of pocket for like 10 grand. So that way I could show what I could do as a writer, producer, actor. And one thing led to another, and it just evolved into I have quite a few screenplays. But I also thought, well, a lot of what Hollywood's doing right now, if it's not a remake, they're actually taking IP that has a built-in audience and, optioning that as a film or a series. And I thought, well, you know what? When I write a screenplay, I have to think about logistics and how much we can generally raise to shoot something. But when I'm writing a novel, there's no cost involved. I can just take the story wherever I want. And so that kind of transitioned into novels. Now, I did talk about this on LA's podcast as well. As a kid, being in a Titanic movie was like my ultimate dream and goal. And so this story was something that actually started when I was very young. I was like, 11 whenever I started writing this story in my head. And I thought, wow, someday this may be the next Titanic movie that's made. So as I got older and the story had evolved and developed, I thought originally I thought it was going to be my first novel. So it was what my goal was to produce it as my first novel. And it wound up being my second. But yeah, that's how I transitioned from screenplay into novels.
So talk to me about your first novel.
So my first novel it is a horror thriller. It's more of a thriller than a horror, but it's very supernatural, and it follows this best-selling female author, kind of the female Stephen King. She gets a lead about this town that's not what it seems to be in Maine. She can't find anything about it online other than like it's very uh, it seems like a perfect place to travel. It's almost like the Hamptons. Everyone's rich, and think of like Bar Harbor or somewhere like that. But she can't find this dark past that she's got this lead. So she guys decides to go there herself and seek it out by asking locals and doing some digging. And while she's gone, she disappears. And so her editor, who is also secretly in love with her, decides he's the one that's going to have to go find out where she is. And through retracing her steps to locate her, he finds out a lot about the history of the town, but also finds out a lot about her through the people who have interacted with her, and makes him second guess, like, well, how do I feel about her? And how do I feel about the supernatural? Because he's a very pragmatic, logical person. And all these things he's learning shift his whole perspective about life and love and what's possible. So
What's it called, and where do you encourage people to get it?
it is called The Hand That Feeds You, and it is on Amazon. I do have it set up for distribution as well, but Amazon's primarily where people do find it.
I will put all the links in the show notes and show description to all of Tim's work here. But when I started reading your second novel, He Jumped First, that we're here primarily to talk about, people are like, Paul, get to the Titanic stuff. Who cares about this creative junk? But at my core, I'm always fascinated by the creative process, and I love exploring it because it looks different for everybody. But I can also see, when I dig into people's work, a lot of myself in it. And I think I told you, I texted you early on when I started reading, I was like, I think we're kind of the same person, because we're both super, like, obviously creatives, and we love old Hollywood. And a lot of the themes that I was just finding in the first 50 pages of your book, I was like, dude, I feel like I'm reading something I would write. And I just love before I just totally word salad all of my appreciation for your creativity and your tastes and talents, I want to ask you, so you started writing this when you were 11, when you, or in your head at least, but when you sat down to put your fingers to the typewriter, or the keyboard, I should say, obviously, just old Hollywood in my mind always. But what was the process like, as far as bringing a story that it's been stewing in your head for over a decade to life on screen?
It was interesting because when I started writing this story in my head as a kid, obviously it started from the Titanic. So I didn't think about the old Hollywood portion until later, because I thought I want to have this story have an evolution. I don't want it to just start on the Titanic. I want it to have like a incorporate different things that I love. And so by the time I actually started writing, I very much was into old Hollywood at the time. Excuse me. So I wanted to find out myself. We were talking about how we discover the story as we're writing it. I wanted to see how these two connected. So I already knew the portion that was going to happen on the Titanic. What for me was the really creative journey was seeing how it started in old Hollywood and traced its roots back to Titanic. So I started writing the opening chapter on the buses. I lived here without a car, so I took metro everywhere. And I would be sitting on the bus, and sometimes even on my days off, I would just take the bus so that I could take hours to just sit there by myself. And I was on my phone, typing in the notes app on my iPhone, and I would just be discovering the story as I was riding the bus. And I would take in visual cues. As a matter of fact, I would take the bus to Pasadena because some of the story takes place at the Huntington Langham Hotel in Pasadena. So I would just take the bus out there and walk up and down the streets and through these old parts of town. As a matter of fact, the Countess of Rothes, which I talk about in my book, was going to be going to Pasadena because at the time there was a lot of orange groves and untapped real estate out there. So a lot of wealth was coming out here to buy up land. And so I just went through a lot of those old neighborhoods and old money houses just to feel the presence of, these people who would be written into my book.
Hmm. and these people you mentioned, the Countess, and obviously your main character's family is fictional, but one thing I really loved about your book is any Titanic enthusiast gets to find and experience all of the characters that we know and love through history. They're all interwoven from the obvious ones like Bruce Ismay and Thomas Andrews, but all the way down to, you know, your Violet Jessups and who's the actor? What's the actress?
Dorothy Gibson.
Dorothy Gibson. Thank you. And they're just so, they're interwoven in a way that's not like, it doesn't distract. It feels like you're living in the life and you know, or you're experiencing and meeting these people just as your main character Benji would. Obviously knowing your history with Titanic and how much fun was it to interweave these characters, and did you feel, how do I want to phrase this? Did you feel like any sort of pressure to, or responsibility to portray them in a way that kept their legacy in good light?
Good question. Good question. Well, to answer the first question, it was a lot of fun. I have read Titanic fiction novels, not for inspiration, but just because I'm a consumer of Titanic media. And there were times where, I will not mention any names or any titles, but I would just cringe sometimes when they would bring these people in for literally one line just to drop their name in the book. And for me as a writer, I'm like, that's a cheap shot. Make them have some merit, some value. And so when I started thinking about people I wanted to incorporate into Benji's story, I thought, well, what relevance do they have to the storyline? Like, what can they bring that actually advances the story, not just putting them there to drop a name in? And so that was something that was fun to explore. And also in doing that, developing relationships between him and these people, or his family members and these people. To go to your second point, yes. As you well know, as you've mentioned in your podcasts, we in the Titanic community, we're a very rare breed. We're very protective of things that we care about, and we have our diehards, like we love this person or we love this room on the ship. I mean, we can even be petty about like our favorite rooms and get into fights over it. So I knew going into this that there would be certain characters, depending on how I portray them, it could make me a villain. And especially with Bruce Ismay, I know that that's one that a lot of people, it's very polarizing. Some people say, oh, he's been vilified, and none of that's true. Some people say, oh, no, he's a total horrible person. And I'm kind of more in the middle. I'm like, you know what? I think there's a lot of nuance to a character like this, because I'm a man who has worked a lot of jobs. I've worn a lot of hats. I've worked in real estate. I've worked in business. And so from the business side of things, you know, my view of Ismay was he was a businessman. And I looked at his history. He has a very complex family history. His relationship with his father, how he came to be the managing director of the White Star Line and the president of the International Mercantile Marine. I mean, all of that put a lot of expectation on him and a lot of weight on his shoulders. And so for me personally, my personal views, the way that I think he acts through the course of the story in real life and in my book is kind of a reflection of all of that. He's got a lot of this external noise that kind of dictates his movements. And it's not to say he's good or bad. It just means that there is a lot that he's going through in his life. And I feel like the changes or the choices that he makes are a direct reflection of that. So I wanted to make him a complex character. I didn't want to make him a mustache twirling villain. I wanted to make him someone who we see why he does some of the things he does. And maybe we don't agree with him in the moment, but in hindsight, we see, okay, well, now this is why he did it. And he too, I feel like his character grows through the story as well.
As you know, such an enthusiast, I totally respect taking the care. And you mentioned the cringe stuff that other creators have put out there, and it feels like a personal attack a lot of times. It's just like, what are you doing here, guys? But you do it in such a masterful way that the story that you tell is this story of Benji, and it felt like we got to experience Titanic. The reader gets to board with Benji and his family, and gets to experience what the voyage would have been like with him. And he obviously, every character, as you mentioned, like your Bruce Ismays, but every person is not just a caricature that we hear throughout time and get these snapshots, but a lot of times, like, people don't think about the life, the experience lived before the moments that the ship sinks, when we hear these names of people. And what you do a really great job of with your main character is exploring the feelings in the snapshot of his life up to that moment, but also experiencing the Titanic in a way that incorporates the trauma that he's lived. And it is a deep dive into self-exploration as well. But your main character, can you talk about what he's dealing with without giving too many spoilers? But the life leading up to the iceberg?
Sure. Well, I will say, as a creative, and you as a fellow creative can probably attest to this as well, that our art, and especially storytelling, is kind of a way for us to, it's very cathartic. We get a chance to kind of put some of our own baggage, I guess, into a character, and it helps us to be able to make sense of some of the things we've gone through in our own lives. So with Benji, I actually got the chance to put a lot of my own past trauma and put it into a way that I felt gives real life to the character. So Benji, he does have a complex relationship with his father. He is one of two children, and he has a twin sister who is slightly younger than him. But he has to assume the role of not only her older brother and protector, but the second man of the house. So there's a lot of expectations for him, especially in Edwardian America, and a wealthy family. So he has all these expectations he's supposed to live up to. Meanwhile, his family life at home, I mean, every one of them has some problems that they're going through, but he feels the expectation so heavily on him that if he underperforms, then he's not the man he's supposed to be. So I think he feels a lot of pressure, and he's put in situations, most recently in college. He just started attending Yale the previous semester before embarking on Titanic. And there were some things that happened there to really shake his world even further. And that kind of just was the catalyst that set everything into motion. And yeah, so the whole reason he actually winds up being on the Titanic was he was taken out of Yale for a semester off by his father, who took him to Europe, and his mother and sister came over to join them after a few months, and they're all heading back together on Titanic.
I I saw a lot of, and if you want me to cut this out later, I totally can. But the
Sure.
Jack Thayer Milton Long story in
hmm
your main story, was it inspired by that in any way?
It absolutely was. So for me, um, I don't want to project this as fact because I know I will be met with hate in the comments if I say that. Um, but as someone who, excuse me, as someone who is a gay man and lived in the closet, deep in the closet for the majority of my life, I was not able to come out until about 5 years ago when I was 35. So for me, being forced to live there by expectation of my family, both immediate family and extended family, there was a lot for me to deal with, but also knowing what that feels like and having to constantly guard the way that I move through life, the things that I say, how I respond and react to things, if I'm laughing too much, if I'm talking too much, all of these things you start to psychoanalyze. Am I giving my secret away? That really helps you to become aware of other people in similar situations because you read their body language. And I actually use this as a caption on the front of my cover, where Dorothy Gibson is saying something that she says in the story to Benji, because Benji, whenever he is out to Dorothy Gibson and she becomes an ally for him, he's like, "How did you know? You know, I never said anything." And she says, "Sometimes it's everything that someone doesn't say that speaks the loudest." And that, for me, is something that I'm able to read into other people who are in the same situation because I see what they're not saying. And all of that to say, when I was writing Benji, I wanted to, when I was a kid and I first started hearing the story of Milton Long and Jack Thayer, I remember reading it as an 11-year-old and thinking, there is more to this than just they met the night the ship struck the iceberg and they hung out during the sinking. And maybe there's not, but I just, as a kid, that struck me. And reading that he wrote a letter to Milton Long's family in the aftermath about, I knew your son and he was this wonderful person. I mean, just an 11-year-old reading that and thinking, my God, there is so much here that's not being said. So anyway, that's kind of what inspired the story at an 11-year-old level,
Mm.
and it continued to evolve. And funny thing about Milton Long is I've kind of always felt this connection to him, and I know Aspen Nelson has as well. Um, but funny thing about Milton Long, he and I share the same exact birthday. We were born on the same day. He is from Springfield, Massachusetts. I'm from Springfield, Missouri.
Whoa.
I know, I know. But yeah, I literally just I've always had a strong connection to both of them. But
Yeah. Have you read Nelson's book?
I have started reading it.
Okay.
I actually told Nelson when I was finishing up my book when his came out and he was on your podcast, and I said, "Hey, your story sounds so intriguing and amazing. I am not going to read it until my book is completely published because I don't want it to seem like I'm ripping off ideas from somebody else.
Yeah.
So I will read it."
I mean, there's no ripping off of ideas, and that's obvious if anyone reads both books. But um, I it's amazing, and one of the reasons I think Titanic's story continues is that we see ourselves in these historical figures, as you just explored. But any podcast you listen to where the question is posited, like why are we still talking about, why are we still so interested in Titanic? And I think in my opinion, the answer is the stories, and the stories of the people, and the reflections that we see of ourselves in these people who met either a tragic end or survived and then had to deal with that trauma for the rest of their lives. But it's just such an interesting bank of humanity that we'll never overdraw from.
100%. 100%. And that's, you hit the nail on the head. I said the same thing on LA's podcast is Titanic is literally a ship of stories. Each person has such an interesting story. And it's only exacerbated by the fact that they all spent this collective moment on a ship that was sinking. But it took so long to sink that you had all this time for drama to play out. And it just makes all of their stories that much more interesting.
Well, I give it a 10 out of 10, and I thank you for sending it my way. I got an early copy. I've been waiting. Is there a hard copy on the way? Because I've been waiting to order.
Yeah, there is. Man, I'm going through some issues with the distributor for the hard copy, but yes,
Okay.
there is.
Okay. But you are going to be on the Queen Mary, as I mentioned at the beginning, for our Titanic weekend, April 11 through 14. And I encourage anyone out there who's in the LA area or wants to make the trip out to come join us. If I get my hard copy in time, will you sign it?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
yeah. Very good. But you're presenting as well. I mentioned you're kicking off. You are the first presenter on the Queen Mary. Tell us the backstory of that.
So the Queen Mary, I started as a tour guide on the Queen Mary in 2023. They had been closed for 3 years due to COVID. And so during that hiatus, the city was talking about maybe sinking the ship, or at least that's what had been linked to the press. I don't know how true that is. But anyway, it really ignited a fire under people, especially locals, who for years had kind of like taken the ship for granted, and they thought, no, we can't lose this iconic piece of history that we have and no one else has. So whenever they decided to reopen, like, it was insane the amount of demand. And so they had seen record breaking numbers for the whole first year. And so during that time, I was a tour guide, and they promoted me to a chief officer of the ship, which meant I was like not only conducting the VIP tours, but I was writing scripts and researching the ship to come up with new ideas for tours and exhibits. And man, I just fell madly in love with that ship. The first time I had ever been there was when I applied for the job, and came aboard to interview. But man, from the second I stepped aboard, it's just never left me.
This will be our third year doing this on Titanic anniversary. But the first year it was hosted by the Titanic Book Club, and I was very honored to be asked to MC the live event. And then the second year, they decided not to do it again, so I kind of took the torch, and we had a great weekend. But at the end of last year, a couple of people reached out to me and said, you know what would be awesome is if next year, if you do it again next year, and we are obviously, and thanks to large part to Titanic Honor and Glory and James Panka, who have really been carrying the torch on it, but they said you should start the weekend off with a history lesson of the Queen Mary, because we're all staying on the ship, and of course it's Titanic weekend, but tie it together and tell us about the historic place where we are spending our time here. And we're going to start with exactly that. You, sir, are going to have graciously agreed to give us some history, and
I will be drawing parallels between the ships. So
perfect. And signing books. Are you going to have books there to sell, or should people bring their copy?
I'm hoping to have a shipment in by the time I come. That's the goal. They should be here.
But jump on Amazon and grab your copy of He Jumped First, a novel by Tim Baker. Before we cut you free, I know I took more time than I asked for. I apologize for that. But is there anything we didn't chat about that you'd like to mention?
Honestly, just to throw it back to you, I just want to give props to you. I think that I mean, I know that you say that creators and everyone you bring aboard certainly is responsible for helping to keep the Titanic legacy alive. But you mentioned yourself that the year one, the Titanic weekend aboard the Queen Mary was held by the Titanic Book Club. But whenever they opted out the second year, you picked up the torch and you have ran with it. Looking at the lineup this year, it's like bigger than ever. And you have this podcast that really is just helping to further solidify Titanic's legacy throughout time and space. So thank you so much for the work that you do, sir. I really do appreciate you. And I don't miss an episode.
Oh, very kind of you to say. Thank you. And you mentioned, I'll expand on the guest list for Titanic weekend. You mentioned Don Lynch and Ken Marshall. And it's been a bucket list. I've had the pleasure of hanging out with Don a few times, but Ken he makes rare public appearances, right? But he's going to be there on Titanic, or on the Queen Mary for Titanic weekend. So again, that's titanicweekend.com. Anybody go check out all of the information there. And of course, hit up Amazon for not just He Jumped First, but Tim Baker's other novels, as well as what I love about podcasts is they continue to exist in the digital space. So maybe he's on his fourth or fifth by the time you're coming to it. You can find it all there on the Amazon. We'll put the links here in the comments, in the description of the video. But again, just wanted to say thank you to Tim Baker for joining us here on the show. And if you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, leave a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. It really helps Titanic enthusiasts find us here in this space. And I know that the most valuable thing all of us have in life is time, and I appreciate yours and for spending it with us. And I encourage everyone out there to continue to just follow your heart's fire into whatever next room, next hallway it leads in this adventure of life that we get once. So it's very important to seize the day and make each day count. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.